Welcome everyone to the Interneighborhood Cooperation Transportation Committee meeting for September 9th, 2021. As always, we have a full agenda of timely topics. On the screen, you'll see we have reminders of what we're looking for in the meeting. We will be using the chat to propose questions. You can also raise your hand, but it seems to work really well if we, propose questions in the chat and then pick ones that are really speaking to what the speakers are going for. We have 4 topics tonight. The first is Denver Deserves Sidewalks. This is Denver Streets Partnership campaign to rally around having good sidewalk installation and maintenance. Then we have Councilman Paul Kashmann speaking to both sidewalks, his perspective on the prospects for having a better way to pay for and maintain new and ongoing maintenance for sidewalks, as well as 20 is Plenty, both things that Interneighborhood Cooperation has been asking for a long time. 20 is Plenty is limiting the default speed limit to 20 miles an hour where not otherwise posted. Next, we'll have Nicholas Williams with Department of Transportation and Infrastructure give us an overview of the items that make up the $62 million question on the ballot that are transportation projects, and in that one question on the ballot. And we'll end with Danny Katz, Executive Director of COPIRG, talking about state regulatory topics. There's a lot happening that stems from climate change, greenhouse gas reduction, but how does that flow down through projects that DRCOG selects, projects that CDOT selects, etc. And if you're not on mute, I would ask you to go on mute and get a little bit of feedback. So we'll start tonight with Jill Locantore with the Denver Streets Partnership. Jill, you are a co-host. You should be able to share your screen.
Thank you, Joel. It says I'm going to stop you from screen sharing. Okay. All right, you all see my presentation?
Yep, and it's in presentation mode now.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm Jill Locantore, the Executive Director of the Denver Streets Partnership. We are Denver's coalition of community groups advocating for people-friendly streets. And as Joel mentioned, I'm here tonight to talk to you about our Denver Deserves Sidewalks campaign. This is the vision statement for our campaign, which you can read. Basically, it's grounded in the Denver Streets Partnership fundamental belief that human dignity should be the guiding principle when we're designing our streets and our public spaces. But we are lacking some of the most basic infrastructure, sidewalks, that allows everybody in Denver, particularly parents and children and people with disabilities and those who are unable to drive, to be able to move freely and safely around Denver. And so we are urgently calling on the city and county of Denver to create a comprehensive and integrated sidewalk network to ensure that we are prioritizing people on our city streets, reducing our unhealthy dependence on cars, and connecting people to where they need to get to go every day. In order to do that, we are calling on the city to do these key things on this slide. We need to take a comprehensive approach to sidewalks by repairing deteriorated sidewalks, constructing new sidewalks where they're missing, and upgrading the numerous substandard sidewalks that are too narrow for a person in a wheelchair or a parent with a stroller, or even just 2 people walking side by side. And in order to do that, we need a sustainable funding source. Sidewalks do not grow on trees, so we need funding to build and maintain the sidewalk network in a timely manner, and we need to do that in a way that does not place an undue burden on individual property owners and particularly low-income residents. And the good news is we have a bunch of existing plans that we can use to inform the implementation of our sidewalk network and highlights the particular areas that we should prioritize to prioritize equity and safety across our community. So many of you hopefully already know that the fundamental problem with sidewalks in Denver is that ultimately the responsibility for building and maintaining sidewalks is placed on the adjacent private property owner. So this is as if you as a property owner were responsible for filling the potholes and repaving the street in front of your house. You can imagine if that was our current policy that our road system would be in pretty bad condition. And that's in fact what the situation is with our sidewalks, where we have missing sidewalks, substandard sidewalks, badly deteriorated sidewalks throughout the entire city of Denver. And really, when we're trying to build a network that actually connects people from one place to another, doing it one property at a time is really inefficient. It increases the cost and the administrative burden of building sidewalks, and it results in situations like this where you have non-functional stretches of concrete in front of one property, but not the next, that really serves no purpose in terms of actually connecting people to where they are trying to go. It truly is a citywide problem. 40% of Denver streets have missing or substandard sidewalks. You can see examples of both in the picture here from the Sunnyside neighborhood. 10% of our streets have no sidewalks at all. And then another 30% of streets have what we sometimes refer to as Hollywood sidewalks or rollover curbs, generally only about 18 inches wide, not really functional as an actual sidewalk. This map here shows the inventory of sidewalks that the city did a while ago. The areas in blue are where there are existing sidewalks. Those are generally in the more historic parts of the city. Many of those sidewalks were built many decades ago, and therefore a high percentage of them are in serious disrepair. And then the purple areas are areas where the sidewalks are too skinny, usually about only 18 inches wide. And the red areas are where there are no sidewalks at all. You can see on this map that the missing and substandard sidewalks are pretty heavily concentrated in Western Denver and in Northern Denver, north of I-70, which, as we know, are areas that have seen disinvestment in all kinds of infrastructure for the past several decades, and where a lot of our low-income residents live and depend on sidewalks as a form of transportation. And in fact, nearly half of the sidewalks in low-income areas are missing or substandard. And again, this is a direct outcome of our current policies. When we leave it entirely up to private property owners to build and maintain sidewalks, it's no surprise that the wealthier neighborhoods have the ability and the resources to provide nice, well-maintained sidewalks, like the example on the left, which is the Tennyson corridor. Compared to the picture on the right is in the Globeville neighborhood, where again, a lot of residents don't own cars. They depend on walking to get to transit and other destinations and are sorely lacking in sidewalk conditions. Bad sidewalks are also a public safety issue. Even though only about 5% of Denverites currently walk to work as their primary mode of transportation, they account for nearly 40% of the traffic fatalities in our cities. And the lack of safe accommodations for pedestrians, including sidewalks, are part of a contributing factor there. Those of you who've been following this issue for a while may remember that Walk Denver, the predecessor to Denver Streets Partnership, actually had a sidewalk campaign back in 2015. And Councilman Kashmann was involved in that campaign as well, which resulted in some incremental wins. We went from a status of the city spending $0 per year on sidewalks to, starting in 2017, there's been an average of about $2 to $3 million per year in the city's annual budget for new sidewalk construction. So far, that's been limited to sidewalks adjacent to public properties. So like in this picture here, this is a new sidewalk adjacent to City Park. In 2017, the voters also approved GO bond funding for a variety of projects, including nearly $50 million for new sidewalks and other pedestrian improvements, a substantial chunk of which is dedicated for the Globeville, Elyria, Swansea neighborhood. In 2017, we also adopted the Denver Moves Pedestrians and Trails Plan, which estimated that the total cost for building out the missing sidewalks and upgrading the substandard sidewalks that are too narrow would cost at least $1 billion. And that does not account for the cost of sidewalk repairs. That's an untold amount of additional funding that's needed. And the plan also established a prioritization. We can't wave a magic wand and have sidewalks citywide overnight. So where do we start? The plan recommends starting on the high injury network. That's the 5% of the streets where 50% of traffic fatalities happen. And then next, focusing on high frequency transit corridors, followed by other high priority pedestrian destination places like schools.
I just saw that.
The Vision Zero action plan that was adopted in 2017 also established specific annual targets for building out the sidewalk network, with the goal of building 14 miles of sidewalks per year in 2018 and 2019, and increasing to 20 miles of sidewalks per year for the years 2020 through 2022. But consistently, the city has fallen well short of these goals, building on average about 4 to 6 miles of sidewalks per year. And so currently, we are only about 20% of the way towards the goal for this 5-year period that was originally set out. And fundamentally, the problem comes down to funding. Again, the total estimated cost to build out the complete sidewalk network is about $1 billion. But at current funding levels of $2 to $3 million per year, it's going to take over 400 years before we see a complete sidewalk network for the city of Denver. In 2017, the city did also establish a new sidewalk repair program, whereas previously the city had been totally passive in terms of not inspecting the sidewalks or enforcing the requirement for adjacent property owners to repair the sidewalks. With this new program, they started a proactive program with the goal of dividing the city into 11 regions, and each year inspecting the sidewalks within one region and working with the adjacent property owners to do those repairs. It was still up to the adjacent property owner to cover the cost of those repairs, but there were some subsidies available for low-income households. Unfortunately, they have not adhered to that original schedule that they identified, and now 4 years later, we are still in Region 1. So again, it's going to take 50 or more years on the current schedule to get to all the different regions. And part of the reason for that is that the number of sidewalks requiring repair is significantly higher than originally estimated. So far, about 80% of the sidewalks that have been inspected have required repairs. And last November, the Denver auditor released a report evaluating the sidewalk repair program and basically declared it a failure, saying that it is not achieving the city's goals and it's actually contributing to the inequities across neighborhoods that I talked about earlier. And one of their key recommendations was for DOTI, the Department of Transportation, to assess the current policy that puts the responsibility for sidewalks on adjacent property owners and determine whether that's really meeting our city's goals or whether we should consider changes to that policy and set a timeline of making that determination by the end of this year. And then I think it's important to point out that even though we got those incremental wins for building new sidewalks and sidewalk repairs, the city still has no plans whatsoever for how to address the sidewalks that are too narrow. And remember, that is 30% of the streets in our city, and many of them located in low-income neighborhoods. And finally, I did want to point out that there is a direct conflict between our goals for providing mobility options like walkability and our goals as a city for providing affordable housing. You might have seen this story in Denver, right, that came out last year that highlighted a program in West Denver that is working with homeowners to build accessory dwelling units as a way of providing more affordable housing options in that part of the town. But that often triggers the requirement for property owners to build or repair the adjacent sidewalks, which can add substantially to the cost of those projects, basically defeating the purpose of trying to contribute to affordability in those neighborhoods. So fundamentally, it comes down to the city is failing to live up to its own stated priorities. You might remember when the city updated the Blueprint Denver plan, which is the overarching land use and transportation plan for our city, it established this modal priority. In the diagram, you can see pedestrians are indicated as the top priority on every city street. And yet we're failing to provide the most basic infrastructure that we need for people to be able to safely walk. And really, it's unclear why sidewalks should be treated so differently from other basic infrastructure in our city. We have an annual street maintenance program that comes out of the property taxes that we all pay. In 2021, that provided nearly $45 million for filling potholes and repaving streets across the city. Similarly, we have a wastewater enterprise fund. If you're a property owner, you pay an annual fee based on the amount of impervious surfaces on your property. That created $50 million in 2021 that went to pay for construction and repairs to our storm sewers and our stormwater management. And there's also examples from other cities here in Colorado and across the US where communities have established a sustainable funding source specifically for sidewalks. For example, in Englewood, they have an opt-in fee that can be added to your water bill based on the square footage of sidewalks in front of your property. That pays for repairs to the properties if you need it. Over 90% of residents in that community have opted in to pay for that fee rather than be on the hook for thousands of dollars of repairs when they become necessary. So just to reiterate, these are the asks of our campaign. We want the city to repair the deteriorated sidewalks, build new sidewalks where they're missing, upgrade substandard sidewalks, and develop a sustainable funding source to do so, and use all of the existing plans we've developed over the past few years to guide the implementation of that process. So we're inviting you all tonight to join in the campaign. You can sign on either as an individual or as an organization on behalf of your registered neighborhood association or whatever other group you might belong to. INC has already signed on to the campaign. You can do that by going to denversidewalks.com, and there's a button you can click to sign on to the campaign. And then when you're signing on, there's information about a bunch of other ways that you can get involved. We're asking people to post photos to social media of the terrible sidewalk conditions in their neighborhood with the hashtag #SadSidewalks. And we'll be actually awarding prizes for the worst sidewalks in Denver. We are scheduling an event we're calling Sidewalk Palooza, which is a whole series of walking tours with city council members in their districts throughout the city. Those start on September 24th and will be continuing through October. And we'll have information on our website about how you can participate in those walking tours. We also have yard signs that say Denver deserves sidewalks. We have a form you can fill out to submit your story about why sidewalks matter to you. You can have me or another representative of our sidewalk campaign come talk to your community group. We can give you materials to send personal invites to your neighbors and friends to join the campaign, including flyers that you can distribute. But the biggest ask we have you of today is to sign on. Go to that website, denverdeservesidewalks.com, and either sign on as an individual or as your RNO or both. And I'm happy to stop now and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jill. So denversidewalks.com, that's the thing to remember there. Jill, as we're turning to questions that came in the chat, could you just tell people Denver Streets Partnership, what is the partnership? What is the organization?
Yes, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we are a coalition of community groups that are advocating for people-friendly streets. So that's streets where walking and biking and transit are safe and easy and convenient ways for people to get around Denver. We actually operate as a division of Bicycle Colorado. So we have 6 full-time staff that support our work. And then we have currently a coalition of about 24 different community organizations who come together monthly for our steering committee meetings. And they help us develop our campaigns like Sidewalks and 20 is Plenty and all the different things that we advocate for.
Fantastic. Carol Hunter, you have a question about defining the problem.
I'm just very, very curious as to, I understand the funding issue, although I don't understand the funding issue in some respects, but what are the problems here? What are the 3 most difficult things that we have to surmount here that isn't, so that this isn't happening, that these things are not being built, they're not being improved, they're not being redone?
So it's two fundamental problems. It's that the responsibility is on the adjacent private property owner, and the city has basically not enforced that requirement for decades. And also it's the lack of funding. That if we were actually as a city to take over responsibility for building and repairing the sidewalks the same way the city is responsible for building and repairing the streets, there would need to be an adequate funding source to make that happen. And as we learned from the Denver Moose Pedestrians and Trails Plan, that would be about $1 billion, which sounds like a lot. But if you think about it, that's building out a complete network across the entire city that would benefit every neighborhood in Denver. By comparison, the Central I-70 project, which is reconstructing just 5 miles of a highway, is a $2 to $3 billion project. So by comparison, sidewalks are actually very affordable. It's just when you're building out the entire city's network all at once, it becomes expensive. So we need a sustained, dedicated annual funding source to chip away at that problem and build out the network in a more timely manner.
That is a priority.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Lucia asked, Jill, you were just mentioning that, right now, in theory, it's the responsibility of the adjacent property owner, and the city will inspect and require them to be repaired. But Lucia asked, what happened to neighborhood inspections? Why doesn't this work?
So there were numerous problems with the inspection program that the city auditor identified. Again, it comes back to resources, that there were just very few staff members who are dedicated to this process. And also it comes back to, it's incredibly inefficient to inspect one property at a time and then go through a negotiation with that property owner. Are they going to do the repairs themselves? Would they like the city to make the repairs and then bill the property owner? Are they eligible for a subsidy? How do they apply for this subsidy? So it takes an enormous amount of time to negotiate one property at a time. How are we going to handle these repairs and actually get them implemented, as opposed to, I'm sure you've all experienced, when the streets are repaved in your neighborhood, the city just comes through and scrapes and repaves the street, and the whole street gets repaved in a matter of a week or so.
Amy has a related question about ADA. Amy?
Why isn't this an ADA issue? Because the city came through and fixed the ramps, but why aren't the sidewalks part of that?
So the reason the city fixes the curb ramps is because they were sued under the ADA for failing to provide curb ramps. And the city settled that lawsuit by agreeing to build out curb ramps. And so now they're spending on the order of $10 to $12 million per year to build out ADA accessible curb ramps throughout the city. The lawsuit was just specifically focused on the curb ramps, not the adjacent sidewalks. So we have this kind of ridiculous situation where they're building curb ramps to nowhere, to either non-existent sidewalks or sidewalks that are too skinny to accommodate a wheelchair. It's an open question if somebody were to sue the city for not providing ADA accessible sidewalks, if they might also be found on the hook for failing to provide that ADA accommodation. It likely would be a very expensive lawsuit to wage, and to date, nobody has attempted to sue the city for that.
Lucy has a question about on this legal topic.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, I think right now the individual property owners are responsible for if somebody trips and falls, or they don't shovel their walk, or they've got a bad sidewalk. Is that true? And if it is, if the city takes this on, rather than the individual property owners, has the city attorney expressed some kind of concern about the city therefore is liable?
So there definitely are liability issues. You know, if the city builds a sidewalk and it's defective and somebody trips and falls, then they would potentially be liable for a lawsuit. But there are ways to manage that liability. That same liability applies to the streets. If there's a pothole in the street and I've hit a pothole on my bike and crashed and fallen and hurt myself, I could have sued the city for that too. But the city has put measures in place to manage that liability, and they could do the exact same thing for sidewalks if it was a priority for them to do so.
And Jill, you showed a picture with some overgrown bushes making a sidewalk impassable. Just to save a little time here, I'll just say that Lucia asked a question: does right-of-way inspections deal with things like those bushes? And obviously, how effective is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to the sidewalk repairs itself. If you see a situation like that, you could submit a complaint via 311 and neighborhood inspections would come out and could potentially cite the homeowner and require them to trim the bushes. The picture demonstrated that when you have these really skinny sidewalks that are only 18 inches wide, those overgrown bushes become especially problematic because there is so little space to begin with. It doesn't take much bush growth to make that sidewalk impassable. Whereas if we actually had, the desired standard of at least 6 feet wide sidewalks, those types of issues would be much less prevalent throughout the city.
Okay, we're in our last minute. Let me turn to Mark, who has a question about safe routes to school.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So in the Corey Merrill neighborhood over the last 18 months along Florida and I believe Iowa, I know that, and I believe it's under contracts from DOTI. I'm maybe wrong about this. I don't think it's DPS at all. But there have been new sidewalk constructed in the public right-of-way next to dozens of houses in that neighborhood. So the city clearly can and will construct new sidewalk when they are forced to. So I'm just curious, how do these sort of magical programs happen that force the issue?
Well, I think you have your council member Kashmann to thank for being a champion for that specific sidewalk project. And you are absolutely right. That is an illustration that the city can build sidewalks if they want to. And those are among the 4 to 6 miles of sidewalks per year that the city has been building. So it just goes to show it's not that the city can't build sidewalks, it's just that we have not prioritized doing it at the scale that's necessary to truly address the problem.
Okay, so we have this funny case where we've got this public infrastructure that has this legal fiction that's the responsibility of the adjacent homeowner, and the city feels they have some protection due to that legal fiction, but the result is a terrible situation in terms of the quality of sidewalks. Please sign on denversidewalks.com to that letter. We're going to try to put a lot of pressure on the city and the mayor in his last term to end with a really good lasting legacy. There were some other questions we didn't get to. One of them about what may be in the bond funding. Certainly no systemic ongoing funding, but what will be in there sidewalks related. That will be our speaker after this. But we're going to turn now to Councilman Paul Kashmann, who has been a leader on council for these kind of topics, to give us a perspective of what are the prospects for finally doing something big and sustainable for sidewalks, as well as what's going on with changing the default speed limit in Denver that would apply to roads that don't otherwise have a speed limit posted, such as most neighborhood streets. Councilman Kashmann.
Thank you, Joel. Good to see everybody here. It's always fun coming to this committee as a bunch of people who actually know what they're talking about, and great questions and great ideas. So I was able in the 2020 budget to get $350,000 put forward for a study of speed limits with the goal of seeing if we can't reduce the default speed limit and the speed limit on neighborhood streets from 25 to 20, better known as the 20 is plenty initiative. The study actually went considerably past that. It looked at neighborhood streets, it looked at arterials and collectors, it looked at school zones, and it also looked as what they call slow zones. high pedestrian areas, like might be around recreation centers, other such uses. The study, I'm very heartened to say, DOTI gave me the go-ahead yesterday to put forth change to the ordinance that details speeds on our streets to reduce the speed on neighborhood streets from 25 to 20. It's that's the good news. The bad news is it's not going to be an overnight deal where you wake up tomorrow morning, all the signs are changed out, and we can now begin enforcement. What Mike King, who's been the point person on this effort, has done a great job, along with the rest of the DOTI team, tells me they're looking at currently about a 3-year rollout. They estimate right now that there are 3,500 local speed limit signs around the city. What the plan is not to replace all those 25-mile-an-hour speed limit signs with 20s, but to remove many of them and then to have gateway signs as you enter neighborhoods saying that the speed limit on unposted streets is 20 miles per hour. There'll be gateway signs at entrances to the city as well, making the same statement. The DOTI is contracted out for a Google sweep study of all speed limit signs in the entire city, which would be an 8-month effort. They hope to complete in 2022. As I said, it's not going to be first we do the neighborhood streets, then we look at the arterials. It's all kind of taking place at the same time. They certainly want to focus on the high injury network and accelerate whatever changes are necessary to move us closer to our Vision Zero goal. But the change on the neighborhood streets is part of a change in the culture, just to get people to slow down and to begin or to continue what I've seen as a nascent effort to, as Jill pointed out in Blueprint Denver, it clearly states that the prime directive on all of our streets is the safety of pedestrians. But as we all know, we're not doing nearly a good enough job at that. So, the DOTI expects to have costs in the next week or so for a variety of options on how we would implement the 20 is Plenty program. Looking at the possibility of yard signs that people can put up around the city within the neighborhoods, and a variety of education options. I'm very excited at the progress, for sure, that they're willing to give support to this speed limit reduction and to continue their work on the more critical areas. They're also talking about one area that the study really red flagged, is that Denver is behind national standards in the consistency of how we mark our areas around our schools. There is no real consistency, and it's always been a priority of mine that, it's my feeling that when you approach a school, no matter where you are in the city, it should all look the same. Maybe the first thing you see is a yellow sign that says school zone ahead, and then 50 yards ahead of that, there's a flashing light, et cetera, et cetera. So, it just gets in your mind the minute you see that first sign indicating you're in a school zone, you know what's coming ahead, and you begin to slow down. And again, it's that deepening culture change that we really it's time to slow down. The era of the automobile being king or queen is ending, and that can't come soon enough. Let me see if there's anything else in my notes I wanted to talk about. The sign issue is twofold, as with most of the things Jill talked about with sidewalks. It goes to personnel and it goes to money. We normally have three-person crews working on signage in the city. We're down to 1 3-person crew and 1 2-person crew. And, considering whether maybe we can repurpose some parks personnel over the winter or so on, as far as the getting signage changed out. But the good news is the decision's been made. I've asked our city attorneys to begin drafting the ordinance change. And as I was looking at the ordinance, one other thing that I hadn't been aware of that really popped clearly in front of me is that the default in city parks is 20 miles per hour now, but the signs in many of our parks are 15. So I sent Scott Gilmore a note earlier today asking if parks would be interested in supporting a reduction from 20 to 15 within our parks. So that's what I have to say about 20 is plenty. And Joel, would you like me to give my perspective on sidewalks and then take questions in general?
Yeah, I think that would allow people to ask all the questions at once. Okay,
good deal. So as Jill mentioned, about 3 years ago, in an effort to begin addressing sidewalks, the mayor put about $2.5 million. I think it was the either the 18 or 19 budget for sidewalks on city property. And I put forth an amendment to the budget that would have added the same amount for sidewalks on private property. And he began this negotiation process that ended up with the sidewalk repair program that kicked off a few years ago and has sadly been a dismal failure. And a lot of people have worked hard to make it work, but I believe it was just not well conceived. And so we have basically buried that program. And myself, Councilman Clark and Councilman Hines have been in discussion with DOTI, with the Department of Finance. The attorneys have participated in some of the meetings in an effort to come up with a better approach. And it appeared to me that we were moving in a good direction, all sides, in that the discussions were more along the lines of evaluating sidewalks, more in line to the way we evaluate our streets. I mean, you can call me up and say, I live on this street, and I can tell you when your street is scheduled to be repaved. Is it just going to be a chip seal over the top, or are they going to totally rebuild it? And the idea was we would evaluate all of our sidewalks in that same manner. And it did appear as well, and I feel confident in saying this, my council colleagues agree with me, that it felt like we were moving forward toward that permanent funding source that we're all aware is critically important to the program. Unfortunately, DOTI has canceled the last 2 meetings in July and August, and we're scheduled to meet again September 16th, I believe it is, and next Thursday to pick up where we left off. And I'm getting signals that somewhere along the line, people are digging in their heels, and and I will report in after we meet on the 16th. But the sense I'm getting is the attorneys remain uncomfortable with our ability to implement a program such as Englewood and some other cities have done. And my feeling is I'm trying not to be overly cranky, but my experience with attorneys is I would like them to figure out how we do it rather than how we don't do it. As I say, other cities have found a way. And, I've heard, well, Englewood hasn't been challenged yet. Well, let's go ahead and implement a program that works. If we face a challenge, let's defend it. So I'm confident we're moving forward, but as has been the case over the past several years that I've been working on this, we're just not moving forward at a pace that's going to make the difference that we need to make. So that's, and I believe, Nick Williams will probably have a better memory on this, better notes. I believe the bond issue has money in it for like 6 miles of sidewalks and 12 miles of bike lanes. And to Mark Christensen's previous question on Corey Merrill, I was able to get, I think it was somewhere around $400,000 for a Safe Routes to School project in the Corey Merrill neighborhood. It was I believe, the first time we've done something nearly that substantial as far as installing sidewalks where no sidewalks appeared before. They learned great lessons on, dealing with the property owners and all the attendant issues. So let's see. Yeah, I think that's what I would relate. Glad to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Let's start with a couple questions around 20 is plenty. John Ricky had a question to get to the specifics of the sequence of actions you're talking about.
Hello, Councilman. I wanted to make sure I heard and understood correctly.
Sure.
Is the city moving towards the default 20 mile per hour limit in the city, and also lowering speed limits on arterials and collectors?
Definitely yes, on the reducing the default neighborhood speed limit from 25 to 20. And as far as reducing speeds on arterials and collectors, my understanding is that it's not being looked at in such as globally, we're changing all neighborhood streets from 25 to 20, but I don't know that there'll be a standard single speed limit for all arterials and all collectors. I think that's still being assessed, but they are, it's all being looked at.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Let me go a little deeper on this sequence here. What I thought I heard, and it may be what I wanted to hear, was that one of the first actions would be you're having legislative services write up the ordinance that would simply change the one line that says where not otherwise posted on a local street instead of 25 is 20. That would apply immediately where there is no sign.
Yes, that is correct. But it's going to take time for us to get signage changed. And so if a sign's up 25 and someone's driving 25, they won't be ticketed. And as well, I've been asked to let people know that there will be no increased enforcement to the extent that this is not going to become a gotcha so we can bring in a few extra bucks and fines. But if there happens to be an officer in a neighborhood and someone is exceeding the speed limit, they'll be ticketed, but there won't be, dozens of speed traps set up around the city right away.
Yeah. So changing the ordinance first, and then a period of 3 years where existing signs that say 25 will either be removed or modified or moved to bring all neighborhoods consistent to the 20. So the ordinance change happens first, and then existing signage modified over a period of time.
That's the current plan. As I said, it's if money becomes available, we might be able to accelerate that money and bodies. The money would enable us to supplement the city crews with contractors. But as we all know right now, everybody's scrambling for dough. So that could be a challenging ask.
Great. And then finally, you spoke highly of the study that DOTI did that informed, what's possible and what sequence and some special cases. Is that study available to us now that it's been completed?
You know what? I'm not sure. I will find out. I'm guessing so. When I spoke to Mike yesterday, I believe they had made the final changes, but I'll find out tomorrow and let you know, Joe.
Great. This is exactly the crowd who'd love to read it. Speaking of one of the special cases, you talked about school zones. Amy has a question about that.
Hi, I'm a school crossing guard at Exposition in Logan for Lincoln Elementary, and I've
Mhm.
noticed that a lot more families are walking and biking since their
Right.
crossing guard has been placed there, and one of the reasons is speeding on Logan. So I wonder, and Logan can't be a school zone because according to Denver DOTI policy, the school isn't located on Logan, so therefore it can't be a school zone. I just wondered, that's a complaint. My question is, how will, if the speed limits are reduced, will that affect school zones? Because it's my understanding that DOTI has a policy that in a school zone, the speed limit can only be reduced by either 5 or 10 miles an hour.
Mhm.
And you have cities like Phoenix, I believe, across the whole state. I think it's a flat 15 miles an hour in school zones. So will this change in speed limit in Denver affect school zones?
Well, the study will affect school zones to the extent that, as I said, they've clearly recognized that we're behind national standards in the way that we approach safety around our school zones. But as far as the exact details, they're still being formulated.
Okay, let's turn to topics around sidewalks. Chris
Oh,
Miller
great.
has a question about the legal topics. Chris?
Thank you. In regards to dealing with the lawyers, are there legal risks of the status quo versus the legal risks of changing what we're doing now,
Sure.
particularly given the quality of our substandard quality of our sidewalks?
Yeah, Chris, what I've been telling people for years, we have a half dozen neighborhoods that are in our rules and regulations exempted from having sidewalks at all. I think Inspiration Point, I know Belcaro, there's a few neighborhoods. And what I've told them is that I just assume at some point the ADA lawyers that have been paying attention to the sidewalk ramps that Jill mentioned are going to wake up and say, your sidewalks are terrible. As Councilman Hines pointed out, since I've been looking at this, the statistics I've always heard is we have, like 300 miles or so of missing sidewalks. And then we have about 1,100 miles that are too narrow for a wheelchair. And as Councilman Hines has expressed, for him, that means there's 1,400 miles of missing sidewalk. If you're in a wheelchair, too narrow doesn't help you. It's missing. So I simply assume it's a matter of time. But as the lawyers explain it to me, one of the things that concerns them, and I'm sure there's some validity to it, is the Colorado municipal liability law, and it's issues such as, if it's judged that we have assumed responsibility for the sidewalks, then we de facto have assumed responsibility for clearing the snow from the sidewalks. I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV, but I got to figure these guys can figure that out. Other cities have figured this out, and I've just got to figure our folks can do that as well. It's too important.
Right.
It's just too important.
Yeah, the ADA thing is interesting. There's a couple blocks away from me, there's a side of the street that has perfectly good sidewalks all along it, except one place where concrete that was put in 10 years ago is heaved to the point where you can see under it. Well, that means, to Councilman Heinz's point, that entire face block is inaccessible to him because you can't cross that one point. And the city refuses to enforce it. I think you were on an email thread that I sent in 2019, along with 311, my council person, et cetera, saying, hey, I opened a case in 311 so that they would then do, contact the property owner and get this done. 311 closed the case.
Yeah.
It wasn't completed, of course, but they closed it anyway. What are we doing about this? I was trying to invite a process discussion. Well, quite aside from the failed process discussion, there's also the failed fixing the sidewalk. So yeah, it may be a matter of time before someone has an ADA suit against the city saying that entire face block is inaccessible because of the city's unwillingness to act, despite the legal fiction of it being the adjacent property owners. The city knows about it, the city failed to enforce. Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, I mean, I have worked with the DOTI personnel since the beginning of the failed sidewalk repair program, and these people are working hard to try to make something work. But when you get reports from inspectors of people driving their trucks up on the sidewalk to prevent the repair crew from doing repairs they don't want to pay for, it's you just see over and over again, while there are challenges to be faced by some of the fee programs like Englewood, there's obvious challenges that we know from trying to do it the way that we've tried to do it. I think the one thing I wanted to add, again, that my friend Jill brought up so well, it's a question of will. We look at, 12 million a year, whatever million a year, and then the big price tag of 1.1 billion, and everybody goes, oh, well, where are you going to get $1 billion? Well, we get $1 billion for the National Western. We get $1 billion where there's will to come up with the money. And so I will take part of the blame that I haven't made the case strong enough, but I do believe it's a matter of will and priority.
We're not seeing a lot of questions here. I am seeing some chatter on another forum of this sounds like sad news, that people were hoping this was moving. People were lining up behind an approach. A question I have about the lawyers and sort of the Englewood model. One of the things that seems attractive about the Englewood model is the legal fiction of the adjacent property owner maintaining responsibility remains, but then the property owner, by opting in to having the city take care of it for them, is essentially hiring the city as their agent to do the thing that is that property owner's responsibility, and only for sidewalk repair, not for snow shoveling. It's clear what that they're being hired to do, in a sense. It would seem like that gives the right amount of cover, but at the end of the day, who are the policymakers? I would imagine that the city attorney's office is advising city council, is advising the mayor's office, but it's our elected officials' decision. They take that advice on board, but the city attorneys are not the decision makers. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. But here's the deal, Joel. We can pass, a city council can pass an ordinance, but we can't force DOTI to spend money. We can't direct that agency to do anything. That comes from the third floor, from the mayor's office. And so, we need that direction. The lead needs to come from that direction.
Okay, well, please use us in the community and the the Denver Deserves Sidewalks initiative from Denver Streets Partnership to help give the emphasis to this that it needs. And thanks for your continued leadership on this.
Well, absolutely. Thanks for giving me the time to talk, and thank you again to Jill, and appreciate all the efforts you folks do to make our city safe.
You're welcome to stay with us for the rest of the meeting as we turn to Nicholas Williams. Nick has presented to INC before on several occasions, and he graciously agreed to come present just a factual overview of what's in the bond program, specifically the question about transportation funding, approximately $62 million. Nick, I've made you co-host if you want to share your screen, and welcome.
Great. Thank you, Joel. Just trying to remember, how do we share screens on Zoom? I'm a Teams person.
It should be at the bottom of the screen, a big green share screen.
Share screen. That makes sense. All right. Share.
And Nick, it was pointed out to me I didn't include your title in the meeting announcement. What is your title these days?
Sure, I'll dive right in. I am Nick Williams. I'm the Deputy Manager at DOTI for Internal and External Affairs. So that covers a number of different areas, government relations, public outreach, public information, a few different areas, kind of policy development, things like that. So yeah, are you guys able to see my screen?
Looks good, sounds good.
All right, let's do it. All right, so we will talk today, give you a brief overview of the 2021 RISE General Obligation Bond that is going to be coming before voters on November 2nd. Just a few disclaimers before we get into it. I'm just here to share information with you all. I'm not, you can vote however you want, but we draw a pretty bright line between city staff. I'm not advocating or campaigning here, but excited to share information. I am also not a municipal bond expert. I am somewhat of a lawyer, but not that kind of lawyer. I heard a lot of lawyer talk before I came up on stage, but I will not be able to answer any technical questions about municipal bonds here. So with that, we'll dive in. Yeah, as Joel said, you're going to see on November 2nd, 5 ballot questions, part of the Rebuilding an Inclusive and Sustainable Economy, RISE, General Obligation Bond for a total of $450 million. This process to develop these projects to put before the voters began in April. Kind of just different departments looking at projects they think would be appropriate for this. We'll talk about some of the more technical requirements for a bond project, but started putting that in May, started doing some outreach, engagement. This included surveys, telephone town halls, et cetera. And then in June, kind of a more refined project list went to our bond executive committee list, or executive committee, and we'll talk about who those folks are here in a second. So that was further refined. And in July and then ultimately August, City Council approved the final list that will go to the voters here in November. So who was on the Go Bond Executive Committee? It was 10 community members, had the City Council President, City Council Pro Tem, some city staff, and then as well as some other community members. They started with a list of 130 projects, over $1.7 billion, and over 6 meetings, culled it down to a considerably shorter list, totaling $450 million, working with city staff, and then of course the mayor's office and city council to further refine that list. So what were the priorities for this? So the RISE program is not just the bond. This has been a broader effort citywide on recovery as a result of the pandemic, the economic downturn from the pandemic. And so 4 priorities were set as that program was stood up, including creating jobs, strengthening small business, nonprofit growth and resiliency, revitalizing Denver's neighborhoods, and accelerating public investment. And you'll see we've done these bonds typically follow an economic downturn and are used to, just like the federal government, even though we can't print our own money, but just using it as a kind of an economic stimulus. So for a project to be eligible for bond, it needs to be a capital expenditure, can't fund operations, can't benefit private interests, and the useful life of the asset must align with the terms of financing, meaning that we can't build something that will be, its useful life will be over before the term of the bond. The debt needs to be issued within 10 years after authorization. And once the debt is issued, the funds should be spent within 3 years. So all of those factors further help define and refine our project list. So 5 different categories, and you're saying there's only 4 categories up there. So Denver facilities includes both a number of different Denver facilities plus the National Western Complex that you've probably heard a fair amount about. So that makes up about 300 of the 450. Housing and sheltering, about 39. Transportation, 63 million. Parks and Rec, 54 million. And as Joel said, I'm going to focus pretty much exclusively on our transportation and mobility projects here, of which there are 6. And we'll dive right in here. Number 1, 5280 trail development. This is a $7 million project, supports a 2-block segment of the 5280 trail. This is on Acoma from 10th to 12th Avenue. You can see on the right here, kind of the vision for the 5280 trail is a kind of large connected trail that basically encircles downtown, the southern parts of downtown here. This is something that's, we're working closely with the Downtown Denver Partnership. This is one of their big initiatives, and this bond projects would help fund 2 blocks of that from 10th to 12th on Acoma. And so this will include extension of the Art Museum Plaza, a little bit more park space, recreation space, places for relaxation and community events, and of course, a much more pleasant place to walk or bike. Next one, kind of a more general bike infrastructure implementation category, $10 million. So we will do 2 community transportation networks. So this includes enhanced bike infrastructure, and this will be in Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, and other central and southern neighborhoods. And this is, if you go to our page and look at our bicycle program, you can see kind of the progress we're making on these throughout the city. This will allow us more community engagement on this and bundling of larger levels of construction just to allow us to deliver it more quickly. And on the right here in the images, you see just some of the examples of what will be done here. So this is in signage, different curb and pillars, traffic calming, improving intersections to make safer, crossing safer, improving markings, as well as kind of how we're moving traffic through. Morrison Road reconstruction. So this is a 13 million project, part of a 2017 planning effort around this part of town. And this is going to be encompassed, that red line there, from basically Sheridan to Stewart Street to the east here. This will include rebuilding sidewalks with pedestrian lightings, better amenity zone between the sidewalk and parking, planters and other placemaking elements. Does maintain the 2 travel lanes, includes bulb outs at intersections, better drainage, and some what we call green infrastructure, but basically water quality planners that help with drainage and how we're moving water. Next up, neighborhood transportation safety and pedestrian improvements in the amount of approximately 13 million. And so this, again, you're starting to see a theme here, includes intersection improvements, signalized crossing improvements, what are known as safe route to school improvements, and other road safety. And these are neighborhood scale projects. They're developed with our Vision Zero and Safe Routes to School team through a lot of community input, engagement, and again, we're looking to prioritize these projects based on safety need as well as equity. And you see less specificity with some of these, you know, as opposed to the previous Morrison Road, where I put a red line on where it's going to happen. These are more general. There are target areas, but as these are approved, you know, there can be some slight modifications to the scope. We still need to basically deliver what we said we were going to deliver. But as far as specific locations right now, that follows once the passage of the bond is complete, and we have the funding and the staff to go out and start these projects. Next up, Peoria multimodal improvements. So this is a $6 million project, Peoria between 37th and 56th. Similar to some of the others, this will improve access for pedestrians, bikes, transit users, allows better access to Peoria commuter rail station, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal up there to the north, as well as a number of other residential, commercial, and industrial properties in this area. And you know, this is a great example of, as we try to build out this multimodal network, you know, projects like this that, you know, improve pedestrian facilities, allow access to transit facilities, really align with the city's goals around multimodal and converting folks from single occupancy vehicle to different multimodal modes. Sidewalk construction. So it sounds like you guys were talking about this before I joined here. So this would be about $12 million for sidewalk gaps. And this is basically part of the, as Councilman Kashmann said, we've had a lot of conversations about improving our multimodal network, including sidewalks, both from a gap standpoint, so areas where there are no sidewalks, as well as a repair. This focuses on gap. And similar to other projects, this will focus on 3 different parks, as well as non-city properties with prioritization around injuries, how folks are moving through their if they're connecting to transit, to schools, things like that. So that's what this would fund, would be another $12 million for our sidewalk gap program. So timeline, we have made it through the legislative process. Council approved a referral to the ballot at their August 23rd meeting. Right now, you're seeing ballot campaigns with a vote happening on November 2nd. And if the bond were to pass, first debt issuance for the bond would be in the spring of 2022. If you would like more information, the city has an excellent website here that really gives you some more details about the individual projects, talks more about the process. If you're interested to see who was on the executive committee, that's on there, different council presentations that have been given, really just a excellent resource for this. And I was going to put the link on there, but it was a disaster of a long link. So best way to do it is to go to the city's website, denvergov.org, and just search 2021 RISE Go Bond, and it should take you right there. And you'll see a lot of the information that we discussed here this evening included on that. So with that, I'll stop and happy to answer any questions, or at least try.
Okay, great. We can leave the screen share up if you think we'll need to go back to those slides, but otherwise we can drop that. And I think we have plenty of time to get to all the questions. Let's start with Bruce Besquet, going back to the selection process. Bruce?
Yeah, ever since some of the meetings about this, I've been wondering who these so far unnamed, as far as I've seen, community members are that were part of this, along with the 2 city council officers.
Well, let's look. I tell you what, do we want to go while I pull that up? Is there another question we want, or Bruce, did you have anything else?
No.
It'll just take me a sec to pull that up.
Yeah, it does seem to be a little a shorter process and a smaller process than the last general obligation bonds, where I was asked, along with a lot of other advocates and community members, to serve on committees. So I'm curious about that as well. Jonathan has a question about GES specifically. Jonathan?
Yes, you mentioned on one of the slides that there is some GES funding that the slide mentioned a few improvements, including some better crossing pathways, specifically bike lane what we've been hearing in sort of local resident meetings as bike lanes are proposed is that all residents are not necessarily against bike lanes, but really want to have their sidewalks. Is there any room, given that these improvements are, I'm not sure the wording of the bond, it does sound like there are crossing improvement. Could some of that funding actually be adapted to be used for sidewalks in lieu of bike lanes, or is the language pretty clear that that needs to go in a bike lane direction?
So my understanding, language pretty clear on this, that you know, we got to stick to this scope here, and I'm looking at the slide, you guys aren't, but on there. But, you know, I think there are other avenues for improved sidewalks. The gap funding that we talked about, that's not the only gap funding. We utilize CIP funding. And so I do think as part of kind of the process, and we have our Office of Community and Business Engagement spends a fair amount of time out there. Has been working, Anthony Aragon, I know, works very closely with the community out there, but starting to see if we can align maybe some of our sidewalk projects with this. I think that's a possibility. Like I said, that there's a lot of details, especially with sidewalks. Sidewalks are extremely challenging, certainly from a gap standpoint. But yeah, I think that's something we could certainly look at as we're out there.
Okay, thank you.
When it comes to the sidewalk portion of this, it looks like about $12 million for about 6 miles of sidewalk, and that 6 miles is counted if it were both sides of the street. Both sides of the street count towards that, to my understanding?
That's my understanding too, yes.
Okay, so one of the messages here for our broader discussion about sidewalks is sidewalks are expensive, and to really have an ongoing program to install and maintain sidewalks would need a significant ongoing source. Just to connect, we have some real numbers here for some real targeted project, but what does that imply for what sidewalks cost? We have a couple questions from Miles Tangelin. Miles?
Oh, sorry. A question about Colfax BRT as they're planning on getting funding and also designing, working on the design. Is this integrated into that? And then the next question is, as with the last GO bond, are these projects shovel ready?
So they would have to come to your second question. To your first question, Colfax BRT is not included, and that's a separate effort from this. You know, I think there's a potential for the sidewalk, some of the sidewalk funding. I know they're targeting East Colfax, so there could be some integration with that. But the Colfax BRT project is not funded in this GO bond on there. And then, well, now I've already forgot. Remind me of your second question, please.
The project shovel ready. And the question, I guess, with the Colfax BRT is they're designing it. Are these improvements in alignment with those changes to the BRT? As well as the small area plans?
Yeah. Yes, they are.
Okay.
And I just dropped the, pardon me, I just dropped the members of the executive committee into the chat.
Okay. And then by executive committee, there wasn't a specific committee for transportation. This was the kind of overall committee. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Also put in the website that gives all the other information.
Speaking of lists, Nick, I saw a PDF from the city of just a one-pager of the 4 or 5 areas of bond projects, but then I also saw a multi-pager. These were like Excel that had been made into PDF that really broke out all the neighborhood transportation improvement projects and all the bike projects and all, you know, the transportation projects that added up to the 62, 63 million. Is that something you have close to hand? I understand based on you're saying there's some flexibility on those projects in the order they're done. I'm just wondering for the group to go back home and say, hey, I heard this one and that one is on the list.
Does this look familiar?
It looked a bit more like Excel, where there was a line item for, you know, this bike lane on this street from here to there, and a line item for that bike lane on that street from somewhere else to somewhere else.
All right.
Maybe it's the second to last on the right. Well, or maybe that was an earlier one. Maybe it's at the top. it may be something you can look for. We'll look for more questions here as well. Pam Jiner, just wanted to acknowledge, she gave a shout out for Peoria Multimodal Trail. John Rickey has a financial question.
Hello, yes, I was wondering, we're taking on debt to build these things for capital projects, but then how are we going to pay to maintain them? And then they all have a service life, 30, 50 years. How are we going to pay to rebuild them when that comes around?
Maintenance, I mean, that is part of the discussion as we build these project lists. So it would be budgeted on most of these are projects we had planned to do. Anyway, these are not blue sky projects. So these are things that we are able to, with the help of a bond funding, pull ahead. But the maintenance of it is built in, if not into the bond, into expectations for future city budgets on there. And then as far as 30 to 50 years from now, I guess we'll just have to have another bond. No, I don't have a good answer for that, how it's rebuilt in 50 years on there beyond. I mean, we will continue to maintain the public right of way and transportation and infrastructure until the sun explodes.
Well, at least we have the maintenance down. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mark Christensen has a broader question. Mark?
Yeah. So as you may know, I mean, the city clearly does not do a lot of its own road construction, though we do a lot more than most cities with our own paving crews and the like. But there is a whole segment of the construction industry that has made a business out of frankly, hitting up states and cities and lobbying them to build and construct many more miles of car lanes. And I want to know if there is anything being done at the city level to ensure that we don't continue to spend bond funds to perpetuate this cycle of big asphalt dependency and these construction companies making large sums of money continually building very unsustainable infrastructure.
Sure. And I mean, I think the 6 projects that I shared with you today hopefully show what the city's priorities. None of these are capacity expansion projects, primarily around multimodal improvements. Morrison Road, the reconstruction of that, we're not adding traffic, we're not adding vehicle car lanes. It's primarily the pedestrian lighting, amenity zones, things like that. So I would hope that this list reflects the city's priorities, which is multimodal, improving the multimodal network.
Okay, those are the questions I saw in the chat. A question for you, Nick, about the sidewalks specifically. Are the proposed sidewalks within that 12 million all adjacent to city-owned property or like public schools, or is any of it adjacent to private property?
So yeah, so there's 3 parks, and man, other than MLK Park, Cranmer Park and City of Brest Park on there is what has been proposed around here, and that's kind of the example I gave. So that's how we, with the Sidewalk Gap program, we've really initially focused on properties adjacent to city properties, of which we are responsible for that sidewalk. We're getting to the end of that list. I think this reflects that. So the department has developed some policies and procedures for how we start to build out gaps adjacent to private properties. So this would include both the parks, the city property, and private property.
Okay. Yeah, and it gets into an interesting area when we talk about sidewalk installation and maintenance. We have priorities in our plans, such as pedestrians and trails, saying, here's our strategy for making sure sidewalks work well near key locations, like key transit nodes, regardless of whose property it's adjacent to. We need the sidewalks to work well. So I'm glad we're getting into that. It is, of course, going to invite that discussion about sidewalk installation and maintenance generally, and not having a bright line between what's adjacent to private property and public property. So I'm glad we're crossing that line.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, I saw Councilman Cashman on here, and he's been very an excellent partner with us and very persistent about making sure we're making tough decisions. We're having tough conversations about this. And I know it's not as fast as folks would like, but I do think we're making good headway on better methods to do better with sidewalks and our full multimodal network.
Okay, nothing to announce.
Nothing to announce.
If you were ready to, we're ready to hear it.
They did say I couldn't make any policy here at INC. Next
Okay,
time.
okay. I saw your name in Denverite, so I was hoping you wanted to use this forum.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else? I think we've run to the end of our questions. Anything else for us tonight? Pam Joyner has her hand raised.
Hi, team. I was just wondering, is there any allowance or mention of crosswalks, stop signs, traffic beacons for pedestrians crossing streets, especially in our...
Pam, I lost you. I don't know if everyone else did.
I can hear you, Nick. So I think we heard the essence of the question.
I got the gist of it. Yeah. So yes. So we would. So a number of these. So the bike infrastructure would include. She back. I'll start back. So a number of these. The bike infrastructure project does include the $10 million does include traffic modification, traffic calming, intersection improvements. Morrison Road, same thing. I'm just going to try to find one that doesn't at this point. Sidewalk construction. That seems like the only one that's not going to get real deep into, but I think that's still aligned with what we're trying to accomplish. So yes, those things are definitely on the menu.
Thank you.
Well, great. And we'll look around at the website to find where that detailed project list is. Understanding there's some flexibility in it, but I saw a lot of good specifics. And when you see a number like 3.3 million added up, it was added up from a bunch of constituent projects that have all been scoped. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Come by anytime. Thanks.
And now we'll turn to our final speaker for the evening, Danny Katz. Danny Katz is the Executive Director of COPIRG. And whenever I've heard Danny talk about the processes he's following at the state, whether it's the state legislature or CDOT, Dr. Cog, especially things that follow a through line of what are we doing about the environment and the greenhouse gas roadmap, and then what are the rules and regulations that need to change? What are the practices around selecting projects consistent with this vital crisis of climate change? When I hear Danny talking about that, I hear the most informed perspective I hear from anybody. So I was delighted to be able to get a bit of his time here tonight. Danny, you've been made a co-host. If you have any slides you'd like to share.
Thank you. It's comedy hour at the INC. Thank you, Joel, for kicking off with that very warm message. I am humbled. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Danny Katz. I'm the director of a group called COPIRG, the Colorado Public Interest Research Group. We're a statewide advocacy organization. We work on a wide range of issues. And one of the big campaigns or projects we're working on now is transportation. Many people know us because we knock on doors, usually when you're in the middle of dinner, to tell you what we're up to. So for those of you who have come to the door and talked to one of our canvassers, thank you very much for that. This has been a very complicated process. I'm here to basically talk to you about a rulemaking that's happening at CDOT. It's been extremely complicated. The process has been, taken many twists and turns. And so I'm going to try to boil it down to some of the key things that are happening and the key questions that will hopefully be answered. But I just want to emphasize, of all the things I've worked on, this is one of the more complicated ones because it just hasn't been exactly clear where we're headed and what we're doing. So I'll share my screen and just walk through a couple of slides and then see if I can take some questions here. So first off, just making sure my screen share is working. Can you see that?
Looks good, sounds good.
Okay, great. All right, so this is a rulemaking that's happening at the Colorado Department of Transportation. It's around setting rules around greenhouse gas emissions from our transportation system. It was originally supposed to be a rule that was going to be at what's called the Air Quality Control Commission, the AQCC, and it was switched to CDOT later in the process. So some of you may have heard of the earlier iteration that was going to happen at the AQCC. And some of this was informed by the state transportation bill that passed recently as well. Just though, so you know where I'm coming from, this is what I want. So I'm looking for a world that is filled with this. This is the transportation system I envision and I want to see. And I think this rulemaking can help get us towards this. But in particular, the thing I really want is a lot more buses. I think this is the game changer for me. I think this is the single biggest thing that's missing right now in our transportation system. There's lots of problems with it, but I think if we just had a lot more buses, and I'm talking like coming every 10 minutes, they're on time, they're reliable, they get me where I need to go, they're safe, they're affordable. That I think is the big thing we need to do on the transportation side of the equation for greenhouse gas emissions, but really for all the problems that we want to solve. So just so you know where I'm coming from, this is sort of where I want to see this rulemaking headed, where I want to see it promote these options, these ways to get around where you don't necessarily need to drive every single time you need to complete a trip. Because this is around greenhouse gas emissions, let me just make sure people are clear where we're at on this in the state. So the state did has what's called a roadmap. And I'm going to credit, Matt Frommer from SWEEP, who's done a lot of analysis on the roadmap. This slide really comes from him. And so the state did a roadmap. What do we need to do to get to the greenhouse gas emission reductions in every sector out there, from energy to transportation? And their analysis found that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 12.8. We're just going to say MMT for right now. Let's not get into all the nuances there. Of just 12.8 is the key number by 2030. Now, there are also 2050 goals, but I'm mostly focused on the 2030 goals for the purposes of this, partly because we know we need to act quickly. And so hitting the 2050 goals without hitting the 2030 goals, is not as effective, or, so I'm really focused on 2030. As you can see here, the analysis was that we were on track. If we need to hit 12.8 MMT reduction, then if just from transportation, we are on track to get about 4 just from the stuff that's already happened in the last 15 years. We've made a lot of progress, a lot of this on the electric vehicle side. There were 2 policies that passed around what's called LEV and ZEV and CAFE. So basically more fuel efficiency of vehicles, which is going to reduce pollution, more electric vehicles on the road. The yellow shows you that if we just had 280,000 electric vehicles by 2030, we think we can get another 2.1, or if you add those 2 up, nearly 50% will come from the progress we've made to date and some of the current policies we have in effect. However, there are some who think 280,000 electric vehicles by 2030 is too small of a goal. In fact, the state has a goal of getting to 1 million electric vehicles. And so, as you can see there, if we get to 1 million, you add in the green. Well, that still leaves about 40% of the overall reduction unaccounted for. And so there's 2 pieces of the pie. One is zero emission trucks, so really kind of getting at bigger, heavier vehicles, trying to make them more electric. But even if we did that, even if we did all these electric vehicle things, we still are missing a piece of the pie. And that's where we, myself and many others in the climate space, feel like this rulemaking needs to get us up to that 3.5, needs to get us a quarter of that cut. And it needs to happen not through electric vehicles. We're getting a ton through electric vehicles, as you can see, and those are pretty ambitious goals. So this is about reducing driving, giving people better options so that they're not always having to get in a car every time they want to go somewhere. So this is where we're at, and the game is really this blue piece of the pie. This is what I'm really hoping this rulemaking can get us, put us on track to get this 3.5 MMT, or about a quarter of the reductions that we need to get. All right, so that's the numbers. That's kind of where this is happening. So what's the rulemaking? I think we need to approach this as a two-step process. A lot of focus is on the rulemaking, and I'll put up a slide that has the timing in a second here. But just know November 18th is the vote. So there's a vote. It's happening on November 18th. It's happening at CDOT, the Transportation Commission. There's a public comment period. I'll get into all of that. But there's really two steps, though. Even if we have a great rule, we need to implement the rule. And I think so often we want to design these rules that sort of automatically get us to the world we want to live in. But how you implement the rules are just as important. And that's going to be happening in that second phase, which is really now through October 2022, when we actually decide what projects we're going to fund in our statewide transportation system, including here in Denver. So I just want to emphasize, while I'm going to talk about the rulemaking, which technically wraps in November 18th, you cannot forget, and in fact, I would say it's even more important that you weigh in on the second part, which is the actual decisions, the actual, how are we going to spend our money based, ideally based on the rules, but there's still going to be lots of flexibility, shall we say, and we need to make sure that that flexibility is used in a way that actually pushes towards the kinds of projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the kinds of transportation that reduces it. That said, if I had to sum up what step one is going to get us to, ideally, we're going to have a goal. So we're going to have an actual number of how much pollution we need to reduce, how much greenhouse gas pollution we need to reduce statewide, both at CDOT and at the MPO level. So DRCOG will likely have a number that they're going to need to hit as well. I say ideally macro and micro, so it would be great if those goals went beyond just an entire region, but got into some of the major projects that are being proposed, so we can ensure we're not moving any major projects forward that increase emissions. There's going to be some work to improve some of the tools and scenarios that we use to determine and measure greenhouse gas emissions, and really to figure out what are the ways that you get credit for cutting pollution, because all of this is anticipatory, it's expected. So we're going to, somebody's going to come forward with a project and say, we want to, build a BRT line along Colfax Avenue. It's going to be important to know, well, how much GHG pollution reduction, greenhouse gas pollution reduction, are we going to see from that project? So how do you award or score these things? And then there's going to be an overall part of this planning process. The idea here is to increase access and equity, bringing more voices into the process, making sure decisions are being influenced and done in a way that reduce the disproportionate impact that our transportation system has on a whole host of our fellow community members. So this is my attempt to simplify a very complicated and large rule into what I think the main things are that we'll get in step one by November 18th. And then to just emphasize, really, it's about what happens with the tools and the metrics that we develop in step one in this step two. And please, please, please don't sleep on that, because that's really, we could have a not so very good goal, but still get great projects if we're very cognizant and watchdogging those projects. So make sure, follow it all the way through the process. So as I was trying to think through how do I describe the different things that are at stake here, I just basically came up with a huge list and I tried to boil it down, but here are some of the key questions that I think can come out of this rulemaking. So one question is, how much of the state will be covered by this? So CDOT will be covered, and DRCOG will be covered, and likely the North Front Range MPO, so Fort Collins and Greeley, will be covered because there's a piece of SB 260, a statewide transportation bill that passed that requires those areas to be covered because they're in non-attainment zones when it comes to air pollution. But there is some questions of like how much of the rest of the state is going to be covered, or how, in what ways they're going to be covered. So that's going to be figured out here. How much will this impact the immediate versus long-term? Are we going to basically review things that are in the pipeline as we speak? Are we going to review things in a year or two or 3 or 4 years? That's going to be a question. A huge question is this number 3.1. How do you account for electric vehicles? So if we're trying to, in my world, the CDOT rulemaking would really focus in on the multimodal piece, the options piece, the transit piece. Because as I showed in that previous slide, we're getting a lot of benefits from electric vehicles. How do we ensure we're not double counting? How do we ensure that if we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's because of this rule and not something else we're doing that's benefiting? How do we account for the transition to electric vehicles? As more and more come onto the road, the more that you replace cars, the less pollution impact you'll have, because those are cleaner cars that we're now replacing. In my world, that's great, because there are other problems we're trying to get at, not just pollution, but from a strictly GHG emissions reduction effort, there's a question of just how do we account for electric vehicles? Should this rule be about more electric vehicles, or should it be more focused on transit? So that's a big one. The enforcement piece will be key. Usually enforcement in the transportation space means funding. You do or don't get money if you do or don't do the right thing. So, what are we talking about here? There's some flexible dollars. There are less flexible dollars. How are we going to use that to enforce that communities are actually meeting the greenhouse gas emissions reductions? The next one, exceed and then mitigate, or don't exceed. I mean, there's a philosophy out there that's like, all right, we need to build a new road. We need to widen a new road. That will probably result in extra pollution, but we'll reduce that pollution by doing something else somewhere else that reduces pollution equal or more. Should this rule allow that to happen? We can exceed by building projects that increase pollution, but we just reduce that pollution in some other place. Or should it really be a nothing moves forward that actually increases pollution? I think that's going to be a big battle. I think there's definitely different positions and different philosophies on that one. And that's going to be key. I mentioned equity earlier. How will equity play out in this process? Is this going to be an equitable process? Will there be opportunities for people who don't normally get to participate to actually participate? Will the outcomes be equitable? In other words, will those disproportionately impacted communities see a disproportionate benefit? That really is harder when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, because it's a global pollution. So just reducing it anywhere is a benefit. But for some of the co-pollutants that come from the transportation sector, we know there are hotspots near highways. And so you could imagine reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but still leaving those hotspots. I think there's a number of advocates and supporters who would not want to see that happen. So how will equity play out, and how will that be measured? There's just questions around the metrics, like how do you score things? If you build a bike lane, what sort of greenhouse gas emissions reductions do you get from that versus a BRT line? If you widen a highway, how much greenhouse gas emission increase do you get? There is definitely a debate, or at least I've had criticisms that too often we widen highways and don't account for the pollution that actually comes, and lo and behold, it has traditionally come. So there's some really big questions on the metrics there, and some real big opportunities for folks, especially if you have any technical analysis or skills, to be able to get in there and help make sure we're rewarding things that are really bending the curve down, and helping figure out how to reward those, quote, smaller projects like sidewalks that really can add up. In the DRCOG region, we know, especially, is there going to be a region-wide, or a region-wide goal? Are there going to be goals in the sub-regions? For those of you who are familiar, Denver is its own sub-region, so we can basically, as a city, decide what we want to do with the DRCOG dollars that are sub-regional. But Denver's decisions might be different than another sub-region. So should we be ensuring each sub-region is cutting pollution, or do we risk the chance that one area is building a highway while another area is trying to roll out transit and kind of negating each other? There's an emphasis on regionally significant projects, but there's some who say lots of small things add up to big benefits like sidewalks and bike lanes. So how are we going to do that? And then modeling. I've been particularly frustrated with modeling recently. For those of you probably are all aware, we've missed our non-attainment deadline yet again on air pollution in the Denver metro region. And it does feel like every couple of years we model and we come up with a plan and it's going to be all right, and then we exceed it. So it just feels like the modeling is not very accurate right now, or not as accurate as it needs to be. So there's some questions about that. again, I'm really sorry. This is just a long list, but there's just a lot of different things that could come up in this rule, and that you can weigh in on and try to have influence in this rule. As I said, depending on the answers to these questions, there's still going to be the battle over what gets funded and what doesn't, and what projects get raised up. So we can't just rely on this rule, but a lot of these decisions can help make sure that better projects are scored, rewarded, moving forward. So those are some key questions. And I think I'm down to the last slide here is just the timeline. So this kicked off in July. Technically, the public comment period is open now through October 12th. So the best time to make sure your voice is heard is before October 12th. You can do it. You can write in. There's a link that I'll get to Joel that he can send out to the CDOT's main landing page. You can send in comments. You can read the documents. They came out with a cost-benefit analysis today of the rule, which shows all sorts of other benefits that come from this. The amount of money people could save by not having to pay for gas and not having to, and being able to save money on car trips and other pollutants and safety benefits, all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of good stuff there, but the bottom line is October 12th is the last official day to publicly comment on it. It's a little unclear. I mean, there's going to be a vote on November 18th, and you could certainly speak up at the Transportation Commission meeting that day, but by that point, they'll mostly have made their decision. So I encourage you weigh in before October 12th. Happy to help folks with any comments. And then the idea is that they'll vote on it November 18th, and whatever is adopted will go into effect by January, and that will influence their upcoming plans. There is a caveat there, which is federal dollars are going to be coming into Colorado, pouring into Colorado soon. It's possible CDOT starts updating some of those plans even earlier. I'm going to be watchdogging that because I want to make sure we're actually using the greenhouse gas emission rules for any new funding, but timing could squish that a bit. There are hearings all across the state as well. I don't have the dates for those. They're setting those right now. Again, you can check on the website, and you can actually go to a hearing too if you don't want to send in a comment. You can speak up at those hearings as well. So that's this is just the official cut and paste from their website. So if you want any more information, I attempt to be an expert on this, but there are others out there who know a lot as well. So happy to steer you in the right direction. And I think just bottom line, I just want to make sure people walk away. The rulemaking is important. The decisions that happen in November will be important, but it will be even more important to make sure we're implementing the rules in a way that actually results in what I think is ultimately what we need to do, which is less highway expansion projects, which ultimately increase pollution, and a heck of a lot more transit, walking, biking, and other modes, land use reforms that get us to where, to just a world where people don't have to drive every time they want to complete a trip. Okay, that was my attempt to simplify all this down. I will stop my share and see what questions I can answer.
Thank you. So there'll be a link for if we want to individually comment on the rulemaking, you'll provide that. I will pass that along. Other than COPIRG or beyond COPIRG, if individuals on the call or watching the recording wanted to get together with other organizations that are active on this topic, what are some of the other organizations they might be familiar with, might already have an affiliation with?
That's a great question. Thank you. There are a lot of groups working on this. In the climate space, again, because it's a greenhouse gas rule, I mean, there's almost every group that I think you could think of on the climate side. There's 350 Colorado, there's Sierra Club, there's NRDC, there are local groups, there's Green Latinos, there's just a number of organizations that are working on this. There are Denver Streets Partnership is trying to take a look at this from the Denver perspective. And there are other groups across the state. There are local governments are going to be heavily involved. DRCOG will be heavily involved because this rule impacts not just CDOT's decisions, but DRCOG's planning decisions as well. So local governments will be a major voice. And then there'll definitely be all sorts of business interests and industry interests will be getting involved to the extent that they think this is going to impact them and their bottom lines as well.
So if us or our organizations are already aligned with one of those groups, we could probably reach out to them and say, how can we amplify our voices in pushing for what those organizations want, including your organization wants to see in these rules?
Absolutely, yeah. This is seen as this is one of the biggest things we'll be doing, especially in transportation. especially if that federal infrastructure bill passes and we get billions of dollars, this rule could help steer those dollars. And so at least that's the vision that I have, that this rule will set the metrics or filters for those dollars and for all the additional dollars coming from SB 260, state bill and whatnot. So yes, there are a ton of groups active and involved. And if you want yours to be your connected, just let me know.
Great. Zooming out for a moment, Miles has a question about how the numbers of, I guess, the emissions from transportation compared to emissions from other areas, including drilling and fracking. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, so currently transportation is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Colorado. It just barely passed the energy sector, which is getting cleaner as we go more renewable. The building sector is also very large as well. So the amount of energy we consume in our buildings. So those are probably those are three big greenhouse gas emissions. But the thing that's on my mind recently is ozone pollution. And so, you know, one of the things I think is important about this rule, even though it's around greenhouse gas emissions, if we care about air quality and ozone, usually the things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in transportation also reduce ozone pollution, or the things that cause ozone pollution. So I would encourage you to get involved there. And when it comes to ozone pollution, transportation's one of two leading factors in the Front Range, along with oil and gas. So all the oil and gas industry, the drilling that's happening. So those two are major sources. Oil and gas is also a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's playing a larger role right now in our ozone air quality days.
Okay. David Mincer has a question about what projects these rules will be applicable to. David.
Oh, hi. I think you actually touched on this later on, but my specific question was the projects that are being planned currently, are they going to be reassessed, or are they a done deal, or do we not know?
So the two things the one thing we have in writing, so to speak, is what was in SB 260, and SB 260, excuse me, specifically called out I-270 as a project that would have to meet higher standards, but it didn't spell that out. So, but then it also specifically called out projects that had a, now I'm forgetting the term. It's basically they were like a record of decision, or it started the process that those would not have to abide by some of these standards. And so there are certainly some projects that are moving forward right now that, as of right now, I don't think will be reevaluated. There are some projects that might be reevaluated. And I think this goes back to that big question of, is it how short-term is this? How much will this rule impact things starting on January 1st of next year versus impacting things that we're then going to plan for in a couple of years? And so if you want to make sure things that are moving forward right now get passed through this greenhouse gas emissions screen that we're creating, then that should definitely be one of your comments that you raise up, because that's not necessarily going to happen.
Chris Miller has a question about the approach to rulemaking.
Yeah, thank you. For starters, I'm with you on buses. I've had a couple of op-eds in the Colorado Sun this year, including one recently on air quality that really touts the benefits of not car transportation. One of the things I've observed from the draft rules is they really take a modeling first approach to greenhouse gas reduction rather than crediting bus lanes and bike lanes and parking reduction and sidewalk for the greenhouse gas reduction, rather than, and as kind of an approach I might describe as a first principles approach, rather than say, well, rather than build out the things we know reduce greenhouse gas in general, but any one project isn't necessarily going to be modeled. These rules really seem to say, let's model it and see what happens. But as you alluded to, vehicle miles traveled and traffic modeling has never been well calibrated to reality. And I say this as a data scientist married to a computational geologist. Do you know why the first step in the rules really focuses on let's build the emissions and transportation modeling first, rather than focusing on the things we know reduce emissions?
Yeah, so it goes back to this philosophy of, do we build what we want and then we try to mitigate whatever consequences we created, or do we just not exceed emissions at the very beginning? And I think you know, the philosophy this rule has is we want to measure everything and build a bunch of stuff, and oops, if there's pollution associated with that, let's mitigate it in some way, and let's have really clear, you know, things that can mitigate it. So I think that's a really clear, that's a point you should be raising. That is a philosophy that they should be hearing, that, you know, first and foremost, let's just build a bunch of stuff that we know doesn't create greenhouse gas emissions. Let's get all that stuff out there. You know, so but I think it goes back to the philosophy of just, it's about, there's a recognition at least that what we've built in the past has an impact, so let's mitigate it. But there's not, it still fits into that rubric of let's build stuff and then mitigate it, versus let's just not build things that have to be mitigated, or let's start with that stuff first and see where we get to. It's just, that's the philosophy. CDOT wrote the rule, that's where they're starting from.
And do you think we can change the rule to actually lean into that philosophy?
It'd be pretty hard at this point. I think, you know, this is why I say it's kind of two phases, because it's like this phase one, let's get as much as we can. If we can't change that philosophy, let's at least make sure there are really clear values associated with the things that I think reduce emissions and I think have been proven to reduce emissions. Let's make sure those are really highly valued. So there's just incentives and rewards to build that stuff. But I think to totally change it, I mean, for those of us who've been working in rulemaking, it's hard to kind of take a rulemaking once it's been presented to the public. It's hard to start from scratch or to totally flip it on its head. So I think it shouldn't stop you from saying that, but what it should do is make you even more active in that phase two when we're actually deciding what to build, because that's when we can start bringing into, well, all right, maybe this project doesn't increase greenhouse gas emissions by that much, or maybe you have some mitigation plan, but it does take away homes or make housing less affordable or make it less safe. You know, you can bring in all those other things in those projects.
John Ricky has a question related to that. John?
Sorry, I had two questions. I didn't quite hear what you were just talking about. My first one was CDOT says that widening highways reduces congestion and pollution. So why wouldn't they just widen highways and call it good for the environment? And then my second question is, why is the state relying on public comment to reduce emissions? What does that accomplish? If they want to reduce emissions, why don't they just reduce the emissions? What does the public commenting accomplish? Thank you.
Yeah. On the first point, I mean, I'm not going to defend CDOT on that. I mean, I've seen, and it's not just CDOT. I mean, I've seen this across the country. A lot of DOTs still are in this mindset of reducing. If you reduce traffic congestion, then you reduce pollution because of the less, you know, idling and, you know, that kind of stuff, which I think has been proven to be wrong. So, you know, we have a fight to be had there, and this is a good opportunity to continue to poke and bring that up. On the second question you had, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say they're relying on public comments, although what is interesting is when this process was going to start at the AQCC, and the AQCC is a body that allows for the public to bring their expertise to bear and literally propose their own rule. If you don't like what's at the AQCC, there's a way to actually propose their own rule. So I think, you know, CDOT doesn't have quite that process in place, but that doesn't mean that, you know, this is a good time for you to bring your expertise as the public and come in and say, here's what I want in a transportation system. It's like any other public comment process where there will be people who come in and say, don't let this rule stop X highway project. And they'll talk about why they want that for traffic mitigation or whatever it is that they're going to talk about. And so there is, like any public comment process, numbers matter. And so it's important that you weigh in for that reason. So I think when it was at the AQCC, there was a little bit more, it made sense for some expertise, but even not at the AQCC, it's important for the public to weigh in on all this stuff. We don't always win, but it's important to build from every time.
Peep has a question that builds on the mitigation topics.
Yeah, I think Chris and Danny actually really unpacked this already. So I think you can read my comment really, and my takeaway from that discussion was just that I'm hopeful there'll be a way to really prioritize and incentivize the good projects, the ones that we really want out there that we know are going to bend the curve. That would be a good outcome of this process.
Yeah, I think that would be a great outcome. So say that.
And the last question we have in the chat here, Miles is asking a question looking beyond Denver. Miles?
Yes. So in looking at our state, we've got a lot of rural areas. And it's easy to focus on what's happening in the larger cities, but how would this be applied for those less dense areas that just have lots of roads and dealing with that type of those type of emissions?
That's a great question, and I have mostly been focused on the Denver region. So CDOT will set itself a goal for how much pollution it needs to reduce in the areas that don't have MPOs. So there's a few places that Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Grand Junction will all have kind of the rubric they have to meet. And then CDOT's going to be in charge of the rest of the areas. And I don't think that goal will be particularly, I don't think they're going to be trying to cut a huge amount of pollution from those areas, partly because they're smaller pieces of the pie, and partly for the reason you said, there's just driving is going to be more part of the life, part of the way of life there. That said, there's still some really good options, and CDOT has some things they could build off of, like bus staying and Outrider and whatnot. So part of this process is creating the metrics and the ways that they value those things, so that in the next year, when CDOT's approving, when Durango or the San Luis Valley comes forward and says we want X, Y, and Z, there's still a way for CDOT to be able to measure, okay, is that going to increase pollution, and what sort of solutions can we bring to a rural community that'll be different than an urban community, or maybe some of them will be the same. So I guess the answer is it won't be a one size fits all. There's going to be a bunch of tools, and CDOT will use those tools, and there'll still be a need to reduce pollution everywhere in the state. But I think we will be most focused on the urban areas, because that's where we have the most pollution, and that's where we can get the most effective reductions, I think, if we really lean into things like transit.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the perspective, and I'll pass along how to comment. If you send me a cheat sheet on how to comment, I'll pass that along to the entire mailing list. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you everyone for being here. We had great, I think we're up to 45 participants at one point, people coming and going. Good to be back. We took July off, and because we only meet every other month, it seems like quite a while. So thank you for being here, and stay involved in your communities, whether your community means your neighborhood group or the nonprofits or other groups that help you advance your values and make transportation better for Denver. We'll see you back here in 2 months. Good night.